If you are here at this talk, and if you're at South by in general, you love partying. So first of all, let me thank you all for showing up so early in the day, or at least early for us partiers. I don't think there's ever been a talk at South by with as good a sort of audience talk fit as this, so I'm really excited to be here today with the incredible Shreya Murthy. Please give one more round of applause.
Thank you, guys.
She's done so many amazing things for culture. So, quick background, I'm Josh Constine, former editor-at-large for TechCrunch. I wrote 4,000 articles while I was there and was the #1 most cited tech journalist in the world from 2016 to 2020. But the thing I really loved doing while I was there was traveling around to all the amazing events. I'd come to South by for like 9 days straight and just try to see 100 concerts if I could. And it's funny, my first job I ever got at South by, or at my first ever journalism job came from a party that somebody I met here at South by Southwest. And so,
how all the good things happen.
And at the time I was writing about how Facebook events were taking over South by. This is really dating me, this was 2010. And it was crazy because before that it was like Do 512 and random like ad hoc events platforms. And then suddenly Facebook came in and just like swept across the world. And then 10 years later, I felt like we were going to fewer and fewer parties, in part because there was fewer and fewer people on Facebook. And I was so thankful when you guys emerged, especially as the pandemic, waned and we were finally getting back to real life partying. And so it's just been amazing seeing all of the incredible culture that you've stirred. But I want to just ask you straight up, like, why does partying matter to humanity?
Yeah, so thank you, Josh. Thanks everyone for being here. It's funny, we often think of partying as this fun, frivolous thing. It often gets dismissed as something that we do that has no significance other than entertaining ourselves. But the way I see it, partying is the foundation of civilization. What I mean by that is partying and socializing in groups more broadly is a very natural way for us to connect to each other. It's not forced, there's no structure around it, no one's setting you up with a list of questions to ask and answer. It's something that for a lot of people comes very naturally, and it's a way that we build community. We're fundamentally social creatures. We gather in groups. We have since we started being, civilized, I guess, Neanderthals. I don't really know my natural history that well. But to me, partying is so foundational to how we connect with other people, how we connect with society. And I'm glad that there's a group of us who are really trying to make it better.
I mean, it's funny when you think back to what a lot of people consider like their happiest times in their lives, it's typically when they're living in close proximity to other people at their age or who share their interests, and they have a lot of sort of spontaneous free time where they just interact with other people and events or parties emerge, or they're so close and there's so much network density that they can hear about a party that night and then just walk there, right? College.
Yeah.
And yet, as we get older, as we maybe gain more wealth, what we do is we separate from each other. We put more walls, we build a house with more rooms in it, we have a bigger yard, we live, maybe we eventually move out of cities.
Yeah.
And yet then we wonder why we feel so lonely. How do you think about that shift for humans? That it's kind of our natural progression right now, or at least maybe it's our unnatural progression, is away from what really makes us happy. And how do we kind of fix that?
Yeah, I think there's two things going on. So one is how much free time do we have? And that's the biggest correlating factor with what you're talking about, right? We get older, we have jobs, we have kids, we have more responsibilities, we might be caring for family members. There are all these things that fall into the class of responsibility that take time away from having fun. You probably partied the most when you were in high school or college, when maybe you had some responsibilities, but you also had a ton of free time. So that's one component. And then the other is, how frictional is it to take that step of gathering if you do have the time? And you mentioned one dynamic of that, which is proximity. Can you throw a stone and hit 3 of your friends? The other is, money. How much money do you have and how expensive is it for you to go out where you're going out? It's almost like a meme now, you're in your 20s and you leave your house and you spend $50. So that's one. And then the third is ease. How easy is it? How quickly can you go from I want to do this thing to it's actually happening? And in high school and college, sometimes that's like, I just post in the group chat and 20 minutes later we're hanging out. But when you combine the friction of reduced time and the friction of, the money constraint, all of a sudden, the conditions under which you can hang out with people become way rarer. And so that's when you start to really need tools that can make that process easier. How can you find a time that works for a group of people to hang out, which is something that Partiful has turned into this remarkably fast process. How do you align on where we're going, who's coming, how do you get certainty so that actually these 10 people are going to show up so I can make that reservation at the restaurant. And so I think the more that the complexity and the friction increases, that's when we start to really need tools that can work against that complexity and collapse it.
Yeah, because we saw that article recently that said something like 4% of American adults actually hang out or go to a party on a given weekend. I think it was something like 81% want to go to parties, but only 59% even throw a single party in a year.
Yeah.
Tell me about that. What is that disconnect that there are people who so deeply want to attend things yet won't throw them themselves, and how do you think about sort of stimulating those people to get out of their comfort zone and maybe at least throw one party a year, which I think we could all probably commit to?
Yeah, so it's funny. I don't want to be a Luddite, but I do think it's the phones. And I love my phone. Anyone who knows me knows how much I love my phones. I'm not anti-phones, but I think what phones have done is make it so easy to get a dopamine hit. And that's really what we're craving when we socialize. You can look at brain scans of people when they're socializing, even when they're just looking someone in the eye, and those brain scans will be bright red compared to what your brain looks like most of the time when you're looking at a screen. But if we can get these micro but powerful dopamine hits from algorithms that have been maniacally tuned to do exactly that, it's really hard to fight against that when the alternative way of getting a dopamine hit requires time and money and energy and all these things that we have less and less of. And they require all that, not just from one person, but from a group of people. So I think that's really the trend that we're seeing is before, I'll talk to people who grew up in the 70s and 80s, and they'll be like, yeah, we hung out all the time because that's all there was to do. What are we going to do? We're bored. We're going to go play in the woods and get into trouble. And so now that all we have to do to get a dopamine hit is just pull out our phone and stare at it, you have to do a lot to fight that inertia. One part of it is being intentional, and I think there's much more of a movement now towards people taking intentional steps to reduce their screen time, to reevaluate their relationship to social media, to think about what it's costing us in addition to what it's giving us. Is it actually kind of making us feel bad at a certain point? And then the other is to just recognize that there's a different flavor of dopamine hit that is much more wholesome that we get in person. The kind of dopamine hit I get when I'm on social media, it's very fleeting. It feels nice in the moment, but there's nothing that I'm investing in that is going to pay dividends over time. Whereas every moment that I spend with a friend or with a potential friend is investing in a relationship. And that relationship is something where the more I put into it, the more it grows over time. And that's much more long-term and powerful. So I almost think about it as going to the gym, but way more fun.
Yeah, because when I think about what makes partying important, it's that humans are the most exciting thing. They are the best sieves of knowledge. They are the most unpredictable and surprising thing. And so when you think about should I go across town to go to this party, I'm always thinking about sure, I might just hang out, say hi to a few friends, dance a little and go home. Mm-hmm. But there's always that potential of meeting that new friend that changes your life, that new business partner that starts something with incredible incredible potential, maybe even a love interest depending on where you are in your life. And that like X factor is what compels people. And maybe when you're younger, you have more of those things to gain. And so it makes more sense why you would dedicate time to this. But when you think about it as like frivolity, versus something that really matters, I think a lot of people consider, you see the grind set mindset of like, oh, if I take more than like 40 minutes to myself each day, I'm like cheating out on my long-term like career potential, or I'm never going to become a billion-dollar founder. As a founder yourself, like, do you ever have that dissonance of like, should I go to a party because it's like on brand, or is that actually just a distraction? And how do you tell when something is powerful and recharging and fulfilling, but maybe not necessarily productive in a traditional sense? And where do you kind of draw the line?
Yeah, on the last part of that question, I think so many people are thinking about their time like in their 20s as an investment in future earnings, but there's also something that you lose like as you get into your 30s and 40s, which is energy. And so what you have, like there's plenty of people who have been successful founders and entrepreneurs in their 40s and 50s, and that's something that I think anyone can really do at any age, no matter what some of the media narratives try to tell you, where they like idolize young founders and say you can only start a $1 billion company when you're like 22 years old. I think there's plenty of counterexamples to that now as well. But the thing that you definitively will not have as much of as you get older is energy. And
as a dad of two, I can testify to this.
And so that's the thing where if you also think about your investment in all kinds of relationships as something that compounds over the course of your lifetime, like if you think about many of your most cherished friends, in many cases, they're some of the friends that you've had the longest, and there's something that's so powerful of being like, I've known this person for 10 years, I've known this person for 15 years, and you only get that longevity if you're investing in those relationships earlier and earlier. And I think we've all had the experience of also growing apart from people that we knew in middle school and high school and college, and so it's not something where you can purely rely on the relationships that you had at that point in life and never invest in that again. It's this ongoing process of investing, and that's what will lead to you having a great community in your 40s and 50s and 60s. So I think that's one part of it. The other part of what you were saying, I was smiling as you were saying it, because I think you understand this idea of parties as an engine of relationship building better than most people, because what you just said took me like 6 months to figure out when I started on this journey, which was I started by, I was working in enterprise software and kind of hating my life, and I wanted to work on something that was aligned with my values, that I thought was really meaningful. And I settled on this problem that I think a lot of people think about. A lot of people try to start companies around this, which is how do you help people make friends as an adult? And the way I started looking at those problems was, I think in the way I think a lot of people do, like, can you connect strangers based on common interests? Can you connect strangers based on common past experiences and backgrounds? And I would literally try setting people up on friend dates to see if they connected. And what I found through that process of basically trying to create a construct for strangers to meet up was that every single person is going through this like expected value calculation in their heads, which is exactly what you were talking about. So like, given the opportunity to do something in the real world, whatever that thing is, but let's say meet a stranger who could be someone important to you in the future. Everyone is thinking about, what is the likelihood that I hit it off with this person versus what is the cost to me? And the likelihood that I hit it off with a stranger, especially in the context of friendship, is very low. Versus the cost to me is time, energy, money. I have to take a car or the subway across town. I have to do my makeup. I have to wash my hair. Like, these are all very tangible, real costs in the moment for this very variable benefit. At least with dating, when you're meeting a stranger, you get the potential immediate benefit of like, maybe you get laid that night, Like, and I think we're all much more trained by society to appreciate the value of a romantic life partner, but we've never had any narrative that teaches us to appreciate friendship in the same way. And so we don't think about the investment in a potential friend the same way as we do the investment in a potential life partner. So what is already a very tough expected value calculation when it comes to dating, like we've all been in the situation of like, oh, I don't want to go on this date, but I have to. That is 10x'd when you think about meeting potential friends. And so what the conclusion I ultimately came to is that the only way to solve that is to make the thing that you are asking people to do in the real world as compelling as possible. And that tends to be a party where you already know people, so you feel a sense of psychological safety, and where you have signaling that there are people at this party who you will like because you're being invited by someone you know, because people you know will be there. And so you can assume that there might be like-minded people there. And there's not just one person, there's potentially, several or even dozens of potentially cool people you can meet. So against this backdrop of like, how do you convince someone to do this thing that is high cost and variable reward, the best version of that you can ask people to do is go to a party. And that's actually the thought process behind how I came to start Partiful.
That's wonderful. I feel like there is that weird feeling if you've ever been at like a big house party where like you're in a little bedroom or like a side room and you can hear the rest of the people talking, but like you're still sort of sequestered and feel safe rather than being like kind of like lost in a crowded room. And I feel like there's like this depth of safety that I don't even feel like when I'm in my own bed and it's like silent at home. I think that must come from something in animalistic nature of like when we hear other people feeling safe and happy and having fun, we know we're not in danger. I feel like it's like those giant watering holes where there's like 1,000 birds and like maybe the bird on the edge has to like keep its wits about it, but like the ones in the middle are like, I'm chill, like I'm fine. If there's something coming to eat me, like the other birds will notice first. And I feel like that's that same vibe at a party where you're like, if there was something problematic happening, I would know just by like hearing the change in mood or like or din of the crowd at this party. And so I feel inherently safe. And I feel like there's something really special to that we miss if we only go, like if we only hang out one-on-one and we only cultivate those deep relationships. It does make me think that like maybe there should be more friend matchmakers, especially with given like divorce rates and like how long romantic relationships last versus a really great friendship. It's like you might get, like you said, 10x more out of a really killer friendship that lasts for a long, long time. Though you've talked a lot about friendship, but I think an even maybe less appreciated part of social connection is acquaintance. Like acquaintanceship, people just forget about this entirely and they think of it as like, oh, those are just like those random passerbys. It doesn't really matter. Like, yeah, you know their name or you say hi to them, but they're not gonna be like there for you when you're sick or help you move. And I feel like that's such a discounting of their value. To me, like acquaintances are what makes like a city feel like home. It's like, sure, I can have like deep friendships and those are special, but when I can go out and say hi to 20 people at a party and have a bunch of hugs, catch up with people, learn something new, I think that's especially exciting. I actually studied it. I designed this master's program in cyber sociology while I was at Stanford, and I was studying the weak tie theory of sociology, which says that you get more resources from your weak connections than your deep, close friendships because you actually have less network overlap with those weak connections. They know people you don't know. They know things that you don't know, whereas your best friends, you're probably exposed to so much of the same information, the same network. They can't offer you the things the same way. And yet, like, I never hear anyone talk about why acquaintanceship matters. And I actually think it's the one thing we really lost during the pandemic because like people would do phone calls with their friends, Zoom calls with their close friends, but you just had no connection with those acquaintances at all anymore. And that's what I love about Partiful is like I'll look at a Partiful invite and I'll say like, oh yeah, there's like 3 of my close friends going, but there's also 20 of my acquaintances. And that's when I know that even if my friends don't show up, I'm not gonna feel lonely. I'm gonna have something to do at that party. So maybe like, tell me more about how you feel about acquaintanceship and like whether we devalue it or should we be valuing it more?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think we inherently understand the concept. We've just lost ways to do this easily. So I think we inherently understand the concept because if you've ever been that person or had that friend who loves to flex that they know their local bartender, and their local bartender knows their drink, or the barista at your local coffee shop, you just walk in, you lock eyes, and they already start making your order. Or, you know, if you live in a place like New York, like I value my relationship with the people at my bodega so much. I also think we somewhat understand this and express this behavior in social media. For me and for a lot of people I know, like we've kind of stopped posting on Instagram, but the one thing that we do is maintain it for those weak ties. Like I posted on my stories that I was in Austin, and I had a couple friends who I totally forgot they lived in Austin, or some of them were just happened to be in Austin, you know, maybe for South by, maybe for something else. And then I got all these DMs being like, oh, I didn't realize you were here, like, let's hang out. And so there's so many people that I think are trying to either actively or passively sustain those weak ties, but what we've lost is the liquidity of creating more of those weak ties. It's hard to live in a walkable neighborhood because there aren't that many of them, and we can't afford houses anymore, and so you are living this constant renter lifestyle where it's hard to really invest in a place and invest in getting to know the people in that neighborhood if you might not be in that apartment in a few years, or your landlord might raise your rent and you have to move away. And so it creates this much more transitory nature of the way that we live in a place, which makes it a lot harder to have your local, you know, bodega guy or barista or bartender. And so we've fallen back to the only tools that create that liquidity in a fairly easy way, which is often social media. I think many of what in a pre-social media era would have been IRL weak ties and acquaintances have in many cases ported over to like maybe like parasocial online relationships, which I think serve a similar function, although in a much more, I would argue, a much more unhealthy version of it.
Yep.
And so what we're trying to do at Partiful is make it way easier to create that IRL person liquidity again. And that sounds really like technical and kind of weird, but what it means is just make it easy for you to keep track of the people that you're meeting in real life and make it really easy to connect with them again. So I'll give you two examples of that. The first is when you attend a party on Partiful, we subtly keep you connected to all of the other guests of that event. And one way that we do that is if you go to a party and then later on you want to host your own event, maybe you want to throw another big party, maybe you want to run it back, maybe you just want to hang out with like, you know, 6 of the people who you met at that party. Even if you never exchanged contact information with them, you can directly invite them through Partiful. You can go back to that past party that you were a guest of, you can see the guest list, and any of the people on that guest list you can invite to something that you're hosting or you're attending. And so this kind of solves the misconnection problem. If you've ever been to a party, met someone really cool, but you didn't catch their name, or you don't remember exactly what they look like, there's, again, all this friction of, do I ask the host? Is that weird? Do I like try to find that person on Instagram? Is that weird? And there's so many things where you're just probably gonna be like, oh, whatever, I just won't do it. It's not that big a deal. But if with the tap of a button, you can just go, yeah, all these people, you know, it's not just, I'm not just singling one person out because I don't want to put myself out there like that. But I can just be like, oh yeah, a bunch of people who were at Josh's place last weekend, we're all getting together this weekend at my place, or we're all going to this bar nearby. That creates a much more casual and frictionless way to sustain those acquaintance relationships without having to either ignore them entirely or turn them into this kind of intense one-on-one thing that neither of you might be ready for.
Totally. I think you like finally revealed like why I love Partiful so much is because like in the early Facebook era, if you had it when they were just at colleges, you were basically unlocked and everyone could see each other's profiles. And so if you met somebody and you had a great interaction with them, you could follow up and actually message them just knowing their first name. And the loss of that and the shift to like very phone number centric social networking meant that like unless you explicitly had that moment of like, can I have your phone number so that I can text you about something, like you just never saw that person again. And that creates this huge friction because first of all, it's just like a little bit scary, a little bit awkward in that moment. Maybe it's like they're gonna assume you want to like be best friends with them. You're like, no, maybe just like hang out once or like invite you to a party. Or maybe they're like, you're hitting on me, like I really don't wanna give you my phone number. But at least in this way, it's like, it's much more casual. And that creates this unlock of like, oh, somebody I only had a fleeting interaction with, I can have another fleeting interaction with and another, and then that's how you build friendship. I actually built my own newsletter for this specifically. It's called Outgoers. It's like a text message newsletter. It goes to like 2,000 people of the best events in San Francisco. And I made it simply because I kept meeting people and I'd be like, you're cool, but like we've only known each other for like 10 minutes from a party. Like I'm never gonna see you again otherwise. And if I take your phone number, we're not gonna hang out. Like we're just not that close to be able to have a one-on-one connection. And if you like follow me on Insta, like I'm just gonna lose track of you. There's never gonna be like a real direct connection. But if I saw you at a few more events, then maybe we have a few more of these interactions. Maybe finally we have like a peak experience or a deep conversation and something is the unlock that turns it into like a real friendship. But first I just gotta like get to the same place as you a few times. And so I found like, oh, scan this QR code on my phone, get this text message newsletter, and then maybe I'll see you at this future thing. And it was like the perfect way to say like, oh, if it's meant to be, it'll happen.
Yeah.
And I feel like we need more of that because I feel like we lose those acquaintances and then, you know, a single friend moving out of town can feel like your whole social scene kind of came crashing down.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to rewind a little bit to the origin story. You talked a little bit about working in like enterprise and then wanting to do this, but like, was there like a party that inspired you that made you say like, I got to build this, I want to create more of this out in the world, or like, give us that like eureka moment for you?
Yeah, so I was always a party girl. And I never had this philosophical view on parties until much more recently. But I partied a lot in college. I always thought that would come back to hurt me professionally, but it's actually only helped. I think for my early 20s, I was just a lot less intentional in what I was doing with my life. I took some jobs just because I didn't really understand them or they sounded interesting or I was like, this might be cool. And so I would try stuff out. And the only thing professionally that I found that I really liked was building products that made people happy. And doing that in an enterprise context is very weird because you're like building something and trying to sell it to like, a Fortune 500 CEO of like a manufacturing company. And I don't really care how that person feels, but what felt really good was building something and then putting it in front of a line worker and seeing their face light up because I just saved them 3 hours in their day and they could go home early to their kids. So professionally, that was kind of like the high I was chasing. But I think in my mid-20s, it was actually more of a negative trigger in my personal life, which is exactly what you talked about happens to me, where some of my closest friends all ended up leaving New York where I was living. And I had this personal life crisis where I was like, I have no one to hang out with on the weekends. This sucks. And I realized that I hadn't really made that many new friends since college, and it didn't seem like anything in my life was going to change that. And so that's how I set off onto this journey of, well, how do you help people make friends in general? Because all I was seeing at the time was like the ways social media was kind of hurting that and hurting us. This is like around the time of the 2016 election, and I was super depressed. And I think that I realized that friendship was this thing that was getting lost, not just for me, but for everyone in my generation. And there wasn't a party that triggered the eureka moment. There was this long process of like trying all these bad and ineffective ways to help people make friends. Like I was trying like the friendship matchmaking, and it didn't work because of that like expected value problem that we were talking about before. But I was kind of like running out of ideas for how to solve this problem. And then as a Hail Mary, I just like threw a big party.
Nice.
I was just like, here's everyone I've met through this weird process of trying to make friends, and I have a bunch of leftover alcohol in my apartment, which is very tiny, but come over. And then so many people hit it off from that process. And I was like, wait, why am I doing this really inefficient thing of trying to connect all these people individually and hoping that one of these connections sparks something, when instead I can just put a bunch of people in a room and there might be connections formed that I could have never predicted. And the eureka moment was, all I have to do is put a bunch of people in a room. And then I get a ton of benefits from that because I can just tell all those people, bring a friend. So I started doing that for parties I was hosting. This is like the summer of 2019. I would throw a party and I would tell everyone, like, bring one friend. And then they would bring someone cool, and then half the time I would hit it off with the person that they brought. And so I realized that by not just hosting a party, but by asking people to introduce me to cool people in a way that feels very socially acceptable, which is saying, hey, I'm having this, bring a friend. That was what was giving me access to all of these wonderful people in my life that had always been out there. I had just never gotten to know them because I was only hanging out with the people I already knew and was like being kind of lazy about it.
So that's amazing. So then you just said, like, okay, I need to make this more intentional. I've been bringing people together, but how does it go from that to like starting an app, especially when like there are so many apps out there for hosting a party or finding parties? And so, yeah, what was the like, I'm going to go up against all of these people. I'm going to go up against Facebook and Eventbrite and everybody else. And like, tell me like what drove you to actually do that, and what did those first early days look like?
Yeah, so I think I was at a huge advantage not being in Silicon Valley for most of this journey, because yes, plenty of people thought that what I was doing was stupid. That is true no matter where you are, but no one told me that this idea had been done before. Nobody told me that I was like the 5,000th person in the past year who woke up one morning and said, I want to build an app that like helps you hang out with your friends. And so being apart from that narrative, like I didn't know that Y Combinator has, a page on their website called Tar Pit Ideas, and this one's at the very top.
Oh, I built one of these apps, just to be clear.
Yeah, everyone does it. But I had no idea, and so I was very naive. But it allowed me to be in this bubble of ignorance long enough to just give the idea enough activation energy to take shape. And so being totally oblivious to everything that had been tried before, I wasn't really thinking about, I also wasn't really thinking about like how hard it was going to be or anything. It was just like blind, I have to do this and I can't think of anything else that I want to do with my life. But the incumbents weren't really on the radar as much because I and the people around me weren't using them. Like when I was building this, like no one was using any of these legacy tools. What were we doing? We were texting people. You would like write a little message about your party in your notes app, and then you would copy it, and then you would paste it into 10 different group chats. You would maybe like post it on your Instagram stories, on your close friends list, but then you would have to go through your close friends list to see who was on there and like figure out who you actually wanted to invite. Then you would have to check who saw that story as a way of figuring out who got your message. And then people's ways of RSVPing would be like naturally chaotic. They like liking your story could mean that you were coming. It could just mean that you were liking the idea that I was having a party. Same thing with like you would post the message in a group chat and people would like thumbs up it. And, like,
That's
so
the
are
worst.
you coming?
It's like, great job throwing a party. I won't be there though.
Or then you would mention it and it's a couple weeks out and then the group chat starts talking about all these other things, and then no one can find your message, and then you're stressing out trying to remind people that this thing's coming up. So the workflow had become very, very manual. And that's where I was just like, okay, there's got to be a better way of doing this. Like, what should that look like? And then that led to a whole host of product decisions that turned into what Partiful became today.
And how many people out there in the audience are on Partiful who've used this app before?
Amazing.
Almost already. How
Thank
many
you.
of you have hosted a party on Partiful?
Wow.
Wow, all right, great to
Great
see a
job. Great
conversion
crowd.
rate. Love to see that. Yeah, I feel like it's something where you see people who are like, oh, like my house is too small, or my house is too nice and it's gonna get messed up, or like, oh, I don't have the money to throw this thing, or oh, it's gonna be so much work, I don't know enough people. And I feel like none of those are true. Like your friends will bring things, they will stay and help clean up, they will bring enough people. They don't care if it's everyone just sitting on the floor and the couches together. People are just excited to be together. And so how did you nurture your early super users? Because you've got lots of these apps out there that all failed. What was it that like kept those people using Partiful instead of churning and trying something else? Because it's so easy to just like default back to text message.
Yeah. So there were two things at the very beginning. One was because my co-founder Joya and I throw a lot of parties, I think we understand a lot of the problems that people have when throwing parties much more than I think a lot of people. You're different. You understand better than most people. But there's a lot of people who just like
top
make
0.1% of throwers and attendees in San
That is
Francisco.
a flex.
That actually matters more to me
Congratulations.
than any accolade in my career. So.
But there's a lot of people who just like make apps like this, like hoping that it's going to turn them into a party person. But I think Joy and I had a very different perspective starting out as party people. And we see both sides of it. Like I'm an extrovert. Joy, my co-founder, is very much an introvert. She's an introvert who still likes throwing parties. So you can talk to her about that.
You gotta like adopt, the extroverts gotta adopt the introverts because they wanna come, they just don't wanna be alone.
Yeah. And so we thought about problems that I think you don't think about if you are just approaching this from like a functionality perspective. So yes, functionality is very important. And one of the things that helped a lot of people make it, Partiful just made it so easy that you would never go back to texting because it was faster and it removed a lot of the stress. And what we hear from people is it just makes it so easy. And so we focused a lot on the functionality and the things that we could do with software to make it very easy. But we also focused on how you should feel when using Partiful, both as a host and as a guest. And one of the things that we were pretty intentional about was how should the event page look? Because a lot of the other tools out there, I think, are like very bare bones, just focus on communicating information. And like you open the page and it's like there's a lot of text there's a lot of buttons, but it's like what the buttons say is important, how much text there is important, and what we process as humans, we process visuals before we process text. So whenever I'm looking at a design, even today, I'm just like, what are the colors? What are the big boxes? Like, what are the big like squares and circles on the page? Because that's what people are going to register. The last thing people are going to register is copy. No one's going to read anything. But Joy and I were like, the page should feel joyful and fun. And it's not only okay, but it's actually preferable if it's a little chaotic. So it's like, why don't we have lasers flying around the page? Why don't we have like cash gun effects? Like, why don't we have just like fireballs? Like, what if you could make something fly, like Photoshop your friend's face and have it like fly around the page? Like, that makes for a really fun party. You want people to see that and like laugh. And if they feel that way when they look at your party page and the page itself looks like a party, that's what's going to make them want to come, and that's what's going to make you as a host look good.
You've probably all been to parties at South by Southwest or seen invites where it's like, this looks like a corporate like meeting. Like this is like a meet you at the corporate, like let's talk about our OKRs rather than like a party. It's just got this like overly professional vibe. It's too clean. And then occasionally you see ones that are like very vibey, very like modern, cool aesthetic, or you see ones that just like feel fun and casual. And like I think that really does influence like regardless of what the party actually is, it determines whether you want to go and also like the attitude you show up with.
Yeah. It's like, what's the vibe and how can we communicate that visually? And then the other really big question is like, who's going to be there? And so we get you to RSVP so you can see who's going to be there. And that's actually a huge driver of whether you show up.
So how do you become a vibe, per se? Because I feel like a lot of apps out there have very little vibe, a lot of websites even less so. And I think you guys have cultivated this sense where it's not like cheesy, you're not like pretending to be part of Gen Z or even Gen A culture, but it just feels like a natural, like you're naturally part of this, this scene. What advice would you have to community builders or app builders out there on trying to create a vibe or like that aesthetic alignment with your audience?
Yeah, I think that one of the things we realized early on was that because we were a party startup, there were kind of no rules. And if you think about the work environments that you've probably been in, both the culture of those environments and the work product of those environments, there's a set of rails that naturally have to be on them because of the industry. Like, if you're in the healthcare industry, you can't have a Partiful looking page probably, although if someone's building that, let me know, that's very cool.
I work at a venture capital fund, we throw a lot of events. Some of ours are more like staged,
Demure.
They're more like real. And then like I threw a party and just put like a neon, cyberpunk, like image of like a penthouse, and we had 3,500 RSVPs. And it's just like, it does really work, and you do kind of have to subvert the norms of your industry to stand out.
Yeah. And so when we realized that like in the party space, like we can kind of do whatever we want, we're like, that makes it so much easier to stand out if we can have as little filter as possible between who we actually are, like the way that we talk to each other, to our friends, and how the product expresses itself. And so what I mean by that is we're like, we can talk how we talk naturally. We don't have to, in our copy, put on this very professional tone because it's a party. Like, why should it feel professional? We don't have to make sure that there's just like clean lines and a simple font, although if you want to do that on Partiful, you totally can. But we have the option to have things look insane because sometimes parties are just insane and we're all, like doing shots. Like that should be, you should have a party page that can communicate that, you guys are all going to go do shots. And so that unlock, I think everything flew downstream of that unlock. Like once we realized that there were no rules, we had permission to do things that other companies and products did not have permission to do because of the space that we were in. And then we just, I think, naturally went through the exercise of, if there are no rules, what would we build? How would we talk to our community? What would we create? And we made sure that it wasn't just Joy and I doing that, but that everyone on the team had permission to say, if there were no rules, what would I create? And that's actually how some of our most beloved features came to be.
And so if there are people out there who, that works great if you kind of own your own thing or you have a lot of control over that brand, but like, how do you convince higher ups to let you have that freedom? Is there like something to point to and say, no, like, look, when brands do this, they succeed. And like, yes, it creates maybe more risk, but it also creates much more reward.
Yeah, I think that it depends on your role. I think if you're a founder, like you shouldn't have to convince anyone. And if there's investors who you have to convince, talk to me about getting them off your cap table. But I think when you have a boss, it kind of depends on, I think you see a lot of more corporations trying to take a gamble on speaking more authentically. And it can backfire because, again, it depends on what that company feels that it's allowed to do. Like, think about a company like Microsoft. Could they ever build a massive social app? Like, I don't know if they could because they're Microsoft.
Teams, but they're not going to build parties.
Yeah. They're Microsoft. And so, or, when Google tried going into the social space, what was it called? Like Circles Plus?
Oh yeah, Google Plus and Circles.
Yeah,
oh.
It's just, it didn't work. And so I think there's probably more room for you to be authentic in the context of working at a company. That can also like backfire. Sometimes like brands are really cringe when they try to fake be authentic, and then there's a whole like silence brand meme. But you are still bounded by what your industry and the historical brand that your company has cultivated allows you to do. And so there just might be more natural rails around that.
Okay, so I've got a bunch of things I want to get in through quick, so maybe we can, well, let's condense if I can, and I'm going to try to whip through some cool stuff.
Let's go for it.
So, first off, speaking of like brands that aren't so great at building social, I think you've seen some upstart competition lately. This tiny company called Apple released Apple Invites, which is basically a direct clone of Partiful. Like, what was your your reaction to that, and have you seen any like disruption to your metrics from that? I haven't heard of it since it launched.
I don't think we've seen any change to our metrics. Actually, the most recent thoughts I was having about Apple was on today's Tuesday, right? Yeah, so last Friday, we were App of the Day in the App Store.
Adorable.
Thank you. For the second time in 3 months, we were last App of the Day early December.
That's cool of like Apple's team to be like, oh, we built a product, but like it's kind of mid. Let's just like promote other people's good apps.
Yeah, we're an Apple Editor's Choice app, 5-star rating on the App Store. We were a finalist for their Cultural Impact Award. We've had several features in the App Store. And so I think that we're actually getting recognized quite a bit. Like I jokingly call us Apple's favorite app. So I think that there will always be entrance into this space because it's a really powerful space to be in, and it's reflective of the fact that there is this fundamental human need to gather, and that's a need that every single person on the planet has in some form or another. And so when you think about the market of 8 billion people, that's very attractive as a space to build in.
Okay, so one big question I'm sure you get a million times is like monetization. I want Partiful to be around forever, so I want it to be sustainable. So I want it to make money, not just so that you get rich. I hope you get rich, but like I want it to be around forever. How do you think about monetization? Does that look like suggested events? Does that look like charging hosts? Does it look like charging for something else and you actually get it free if you host events? Like, how are you thinking about that whole world?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the obvious ways to monetize in the event space just didn't make sense for our company in the early days. And that's why it wasn't something that we did initially. So if you think about a lot of events companies monetize through ticketing, well, I'm not gonna charge my friends tickets to my birthday, right? Like a lot of the events that we were trying to go after were these very personal events where ticketing just didn't make sense as a model. And so it would have been a lot of work to build that and didn't really align with the problems that we were trying to solve for our users. So we're like, it's probably not that for now. What we did see, and there's obviously subscription, which I think is always an option. It's a very healthy business model for a lot of companies. Again, in the early days, we were just like, oh God, please use our products. Like, we'll do anything for you to use our product. Like, no one's heard of us. We just really want to get users. And so we didn't want to create any friction at the outset to using the product because we didn't even know if we had built the right thing that people even wanted yet. So we're like, we don't want to, again, building out a subscription infrastructure, like there's a lot of work there. So it's a trade-off between building something like that versus building these other features that people are really asking for. And so we just kept at various points in our journey getting pulled towards these really big and urgent problems that our users were asking us to solve for them, and they kept not being aligned with some of these more obvious ways that we could make money. And we were fortunate that we had venture funding, which allowed us to continue just building these features for users without having to monetize right away. We definitely plan to at some point. And the way that we think about it and what we've learned through our journey is that there's so much money that people spend on events that they're hosting. Like you need food, you need drinks, you need supplies, you need decorations, you need like a space to host an event. Some people are throwing really crazy elaborate parties. And so we think that there's a lot of ways that we can solve problems for people related to how they spend that money that allow us to earn some revenue in the process. So even though it's not something that we're doing right now, we see a lot of ways to monetize in the future that are aligned with our users' interests.
Well, I will say as a host, the whole like oh, Venmo, and then like, you promise you actually Venmo'd like thing is a little
Very
bit
stressful.
weird. Yes, it is stressful. And you're like constantly double checking the Venmos against the RSVPs. So
Stay tuned.
Okay, glad to hear that.
That's going to be fixed.
I think one of the things that has brought me so deeply into the Partiful ecosystem is the fact that like I can, once I've attended an event with somebody or I host one with somebody, I can very easily just like select to add them and invite them to something. But I also can't export that graph at all. Tell me more about that. Like that does keep people locked in, but at the same time, like, maybe there are privacy concerns, but like what, should event hosts be able to say, hey, if I brought this person to a party and they attended, should I be able to like text them directly or, export this to another platform?
Yeah, I think we take user privacy and user data very, very seriously in how we collect it and how we store it and who we share it with, which is no one. And that's just a very hard line for us. And it does mean that we'll encounter these situations where the host really wants something, like the host really wants to be able to export this data and do whatever they want with it. But that kind of violates the trust that guests place in us when they give us their number for this one stated purpose. And phone numbers are very sacred. And so keeping it within our ecosystem allows us to make sure that when people give us data, we can treat it with the appropriate level of privacy and security, which we're just not able to do if we make it really easy for it to leave our systems, because then we have no idea what people are doing with it. And systems like that, even if there are good actors who want to use it for good purposes, there's just so many bad actors who can then abuse that kind of access.
I appreciate that. Okay. I'd love to hear a little bit about any major trends that you're seeing. I mean, we've seen like the celebrity lookalike parties. We've seen the like, I just made this invite to like convince my boyfriend to make spaghetti on Friday night. Like, what are you kind of seeing? And if you're an event marketer out there, what should you be thinking about that like is really resonating right now?
Yeah, so we see a bunch of trends on TikTok around sending Partiful's for one-on-one hangouts, some of which are as chaotic as the ones you mentioned. And it was really funny to us recently because we saw Lyft, like the rideshare company, riff on that format. So like they were showing like Partiful's in their TikTok, but it was like ordering a Lyft to like, go to his place to yell at him or whatever it was. So I think we're already seeing brands taking advantage of the natural trends around how people are using Partiful for these like chaotic events, including like there were a ton of organic lookalike contests, but then there were clearly lookalike contests that brands were sponsoring. It was fun for a little bit, but then we had to be like, no, it's done, it's over. We're not taking it with us into 2025. And so most of this just comes from things that we see our users doing organically. Like people just decide to do something like totally chaotic. And so I'm trying to think of a good example. Like I saw this one event that a user sent me that was like nominating like Mr. Santa Monica or like Mr. West Hollywood, and it was just like a caricature of like a Santa Monica guy or a West Hollywood guy, and then they wanted to bring all of that type of guy together and like have basically like a beauty contest.
All the Chads.
Yeah. Like Mr. Bushwick. That would be really funny. And so I think we can't predict it as much, but it's a great reason to use Partiful a lot. I know I'm talking my book, but like the more you use Partiful and the more you get your friends to, you will just see your friends injecting their creativity into it. And I think as a marketer, what you see authentically happening in the real world with your friends, and if you see your friend doing it and you think it's really funny, you're probably going to be able to spin that into a trend that is authentic because it was authentic to them when they created it. It was authentic to you when you found it funny. So I think a lot of brands try to look to TikTok, but by the time it's on TikTok, it's like already a thing. It might be a little late for you. So like see what your friends are doing, and there's probably some gold there.
Love that. Okay, so you have actually become one of the most successful female consumer social founders ever, other than maybe like Whitney Wolf Herd from Bumble. Like you are running the app with like the most users of almost anybody. So tell me more about that experience, and is there any like advice you could give to other builders out there to say like, hey, this is absolutely a space that you belong in?
Yeah, it's honestly scary. I think that being a a woman of color in a somewhat and increasingly public light, like I'm obviously no Whitney Wolfe Herd, but I'm more public than I was before I started Partiful. It's very easy. I think it's easier to be attacked. It's easier to be misunderstood, and you're given less leeway than I think a man in a similar position. So
I think if you look at what Elon does or now what Zuck does, and you're like, that seems like most people wouldn't get away with that.
Yeah, and you're so similar to those apps. Like they're so tied to the persona of the founders, and yet people will have no problem using all of Zuck's products. But I think when you're in the public eye, like you get a lot more scrutiny, and more so if you're a woman of color. But I can't change it, so you just kind of have to deal with it and be at peace with it. I will say that the beauty of building software, especially building in consumer, is there is actually very little gatekeeping, because anyone, especially now in the age of AI, like anyone can build an app, anyone can put an app on the App Store, anyone can start getting users and going viral on TikTok and building something big. And especially in consumer, where you don't have enterprise clients you're trying to land, there's nothing that stops anyone from doing that, which is even more true now than it was when I started building. So I would say the barriers to entry are lower than ever before, no matter what your identity is.
I love that. So what products do you want people to build? What's missing from the social IRL space?
Yeah, we need femmes who are out of their mind building social apps.
Yep. and what do you want to see them build? Like, is there,
literally anything. I want them to surprise me. But every time I hear of like a hot new social app, which is totally fine, because I love everyone building something cool. Like literally everyone. If you're building something cool, I am your fan. And that is not to knock all the incredible men out there who are doing that, because I love you and I love what you're doing. It's just so weird to me that so often when I see those products, it's just like always teams of guys. And I'm just like, where are the women? Where are the femmes? And not just women and femmes who are I think more often like policed into how they're like, where are the ones who are just completely insane and building something completely insane? I would love to see more of that. I would love to just see like crazy apps where I'm like, this is ridiculous. Maybe it's got a lifespan of a week, a month, maybe it's gonna be a part of our lives for the next 10 years. But I just want to see more people building crazy stuff in consumer.
I love that. So, what do you think partying looks like in 10 years? I feel like AI is, how do you think AI is influencing this culture? Like, do we need this more than ever now? And, what specifically do we need as an antidote to maybe so much of our mediated or homogenized experience? Because, like, I think of, the web used to be this crazy place full of all this insane stuff.
A lot of nostalgia.
And now you see that, like, because of these kind of like chat apps, search engine referral traffic is going way down, which means that instead of reading some crazy individual voice, you're reading this kind of like homogenized consensus. And so like, why does partying matter in that case, and what does it look like in 10 years?
I think it's going to become a luxury.
That's sad.
I don't think it has to be, because it's a luxury that's within our control. It's not a luxury in that it's expensive, although in some cases it might be, but it's free to go to the park with your friends. I think that the other trend is the social media is now increasingly AI slop. Like if you go on a lot of the big social apps, you just see a bunch of like AI generated images or bots writing text, and the quality is actually becoming way worse. And until these algorithms figure out better ways of prioritizing authentic content, which it doesn't seem like they're doing right now, the only place you're going to be able to go for authenticity is the real world.
All right, so I'll give you the final word in a second, but just want to recap some of the amazing insights that you've shared. We talked about that partying really is the foundation of civilization, and it is. That said, it requires responsibility. There is friction. There is price to it. So the way that we enhance society is creating ease in that space, and whether that's building a product to make it feel easy, or just telling your friends and encouraging them that they can have a party and make it feel like easy and low pressure for them, and that phones have really hurt social because because we get this, facsimile of a social connection, a quick dopamine hit, but it might say like, oh, that's enough, but it's not real, it's synthetic, and so it doesn't end up leaving you feeling fulfilled. It's just dopamine, whereas I think of like parties as serotonin, like a deep, fulfilling sense of like, oh, this is something I really care about and I want to build over time. But I think we need to find ways to reduce that screen time, get people out of their house and find those better chemicals. And you might have the more energy when you're young, but it is always a choice of like, I am willing to go find that X factor, that amazing jackpot experience. Even if sometimes I go and it's just like a bust and the party isn't that cool, it's worth it to keep on trying, because if you find that friendship or that partner or that romantic interest early in your life, there's so much, so many dividends that they pay over time. And you got to invest in those friendships. And we think about how do we make more friends as an adult, is we have to collapse the space between us. And so I think of it takes time, you're constantly moving, there's a reason why it gets harder and harder over time, but like we need to rebuild that acquaintanceship network that makes everywhere feel like home. Build places that you have less network overlap with, meet those new people, and if you see somebody who looks awkward at a party, like go say hi to them. They want to meet you, they want to connect with you. And then we talked a little bit about how you have to create this friend liquidity, and that Partiful lets you invite co-guests, and that's what makes it easy to build a robust network. And you don't let people export those for privacy reasons, but if you can make friends without pressure by saying, hey, like we attended a party, so come to another party, maybe we finally have that real conversation that creates a deeper friendship. And you talked about your origin story of being maybe less intentional with your time in your youth, but always finding it fun to build things that make people happy. But then you tried some of the friendship matchmaking, but it was finally when you just had a big party and introduced everyone to each other that things really popped off. And that's something anybody can do, no matter what size of their apartment, no matter how many friends you think you have, you can do it. And maybe it was that bubble of ignorance or obliviousness of not living in Silicon Valley, which actually encouraged you to do this and take on these giant incumbents. And I think that that's really special, because we need to not be afraid of these incumbents. They do move slow. They do have conflicting business models. They can't always chase you. And how do you build that vibe is by focusing on the feeling, the sense of like making it joyful, aesthetically aligned with your audience, and throwing out your rules and saying like, hey, if we're a little bit more adventurous, people are going to reward us for that. And the competition is great, because you want more people to go out there and build things, and there's competition because it matters. But hopefully you can keep this sustainable, maybe through subscriptions, maybe through eventually helping people find vendors, find venues, find people that can help them help you build those amazing parties. But that we really need to be less scared. We have to take those authentic friendship memes, find cool things going on with your friends rather than just looking to social media, turn them into part of your brand. And you talked about it, it's it's easy to be attacked as a woman of color in this space, but you want to see crazy femmes build crazy apps, because that's what we need more of in this world. And so even though partying might be a luxury, it is time for us to be a little bit more insane in what we build and what we share with the world. And so maybe finally, could you just give a last parting word to partiers and party hosts out there?
Just do it. Just rip off the Band-Aid. A party can be 3 people drinking wine. A party can be 10 people going to the park. A party can be 50 people where you just tell everyone to keep sharing the link around and you show up somewhere. I hope you don't get shut down by the police. But anything can be a party if you want it to be. All you have to do is just tap a few buttons on Partiful.
Thank you. Throw a party. It's human nature.